Hi, everybody. It's Professor Olson going over Chapter 11 with you. We're going to talk about the later Middle Ages. Just one little point of order. We're going to begin our discussion with the Black Death. I just wanted to make you aware. So we're going to talk about certain crises during this period, how certain systems began to change and in some cases began to be set aside. All right, so why don't we dive in? We'll cover some ground today. And we'll talk about the later Middle Ages, or the so-called High Middle Ages. All right. So the Black Death. We had this little ice age. The earth cools, crops begin to fail, a lot of rain, a lot of blight. And of course, what happens is with people not getting fed, they're more vulnerable. In the meantime, the steppes began to change out in Asia, and the Black Death came over on trading vessels from Asia. All right. And of course, nobody knew what they were dealing with. And it wasn't, believe it or not, until the 1900s we actually learned that it was the fleas on the rats that carried the disease. At one point in 1906, with the San Francisco earthquake here in the States, we were actually at risk of having a Black Plague situation break out across the United States. And when this first began to happen, researchers and scientists were able, by trial and error, to deduce what was causing the problem. Even today, cases of the Black Death or the bubonic plague still break out from time to time. And if you're seen within the first 48 hours, they can give you antibiotics and treat you. After that, like the people in the 1300s, you have to hope your body will be able to resist and recover. So there are three kinds of Black Death. There's septicemic, which gets in the blood. There's pneumonic, which of course gets into the lungs. And there is bubonic, which are buboes, these big boils that form. And when they burst, the liquid inside is what carries the infection. And of course, a number of people died across Europe from this. And the people who were left, from what we've been able to see from archaeological digs, is there was genetic damage that was transmitted down to their descendants in some cases. So when we look at the Black Death, we don't think of it as a positive, although ironically, economically, it will actually be a positive. So depending on where you were, maybe your area wasn't very hard hit. Maybe 5 to 10% of the population died or were affected. In some cases, it was as high as 25%. In a few villages, it was almost 100%. It just depended on where you were. But we do know 25 to 50% of all Europeans during this time period died of the Black Death. All right. It left its mark on culture, on art. The danse macabre with a bunch of skeletons, for example, became a very popular art style as people wrestled with the fallout from this event. Waves of plague would occasionally resurface and people would flee into the countryside. Boccaccio's Decameron is about a group of Florentine youths who locked themselves up in a house in the country to wait out the plague. Even the Masque of the Red Death, which of course isn't written until 500 years or more later, also deals with this idea of a group of people locking themselves up to revel away the hours waiting for the plague to pass. All right, so it was a really big event, and it shaped Europe greatly. All right. Some people fled to the countryside, as I said earlier, and they waited it out. The strict moral code that had governed much of the Middle Ages began to relax. People decided if they were going to die anyway, they threw away a lot of their morality, and people began to do things that they had never done in the past. Lots of drinking, sex outside of marriage. Some decided to leave the church altogether and they didn't want to be going to service. Even the church people, the clerics, were a little scared of the Black Death. Some of them began to stop seeing the sick and taking care of people. And that, of course, brought more fallout for the church, because after the crisis had passed, a lot of people turned against the church for that reason. All right. If you've ever heard the children's song, Ashes, Ashes, We All Fall Down, A Pocket Full of Posies, it was actually believed if you carried a small bouquet of flowers in front of your nose, you could prevent the plague. So some thought that it was spread by not the people who had gone to Asia to get the trading goods and had the rats get onto their ships, but again, because nobody knew what it was, some people blamed certain people groups, especially in Germany. They blamed the Jewish population. Others were wondering if perhaps the Muslims had caused it. So everybody didn't know what was going on. They just knew this strange illness was among them. And they developed certain coping mechanisms, shall we say. And afterward, people always worried that the plague would come back. And in some cases it did, especially in the summertime, it seemed. There seemed to be seasonal shifts of the plague. All right. And of course, many people began, as I said, to revolt against morality. Well, they also began to revolt against the social order. Remember, the serfs had been tied to the land. They were basically slaves of the land. Now what happens is, because so many people have died, the serfs and the servants begin to realize they have power because there are not that many of them. So what they do is they begin to demand things. They begin to demand better working conditions. They begin to demand rights. They begin to demand so many things. And the worst part for the people who own the manors or the fiefdoms, their wealth is tied up in land. They need cash. They need cash to pay their servants because now they're demanding real wages. So what happens is serfdom begins to come to an end. Now, it doesn't come to an end everywhere. Believe it or not, in Poland, it's going to exist until 1861, the eve of the American Civil War. All right. But in some places, people begin to free their serfs and they begin to pay their servants better wages. All right. In fact, this kind of backfires on the serfs a little bit because what happens is, okay, they're given their freedom, but now because the lords are strapped for actual coins, actual wealth, actual cash, they begin to demand that the serfs pay them some sort of a rent to help offset the crumbling of the system. All right. So feudalism gets weaker. Noble landlords are getting desperate for cash. They're asking the servants to now become peasants, the serfs rather, to become peasants. So they're freed from the land, but now they're asked to pay rent. All right. Things are really changing. This is both exciting for the lower classes and terrifying for the upper classes. All right. And of course, because there's so many less people have no desire for trade, no desire for goods. In fact, some people have inherited things. So unfortunately, for a while, the cities actually have difficulty with staying afloat if they are dealing with goods, if that's the source of their income. It's going to be a while before things begin to turn around. And even the workers who are now in these industries who maybe feel like they also have been taken advantage of, much like the servants of, noble households, they too begin to demand more rights. A lot of revolts begin to break out during this period. All right. So for a while, things are in chaos. All right. You remember I mentioned that bad feeling between France and England because William did not give back his piece of France, Normandy, and how the English kings kept feeling like they had the right to be on the continent because of William's ties back to Normandy. Well, and then of course how Philip II, the Capetian king, was able to now start to take back the pieces of land that, the English kings had felt they had a claim on. All that bad feeling boils over. All right. as they're arguing over these claims, we literally have 100 years, actually more like 120 years, 100 years war between France and England. What the long-term effect is of this, because believe me, we could spend an entire 16-week class on this, is what's going to happen is eventually the English will be forced to stay in England and the French will be able to stay in France and have claims over all of France again. Gunpowder technology had been evolving. It will be cannons that will decide Constantinople's fate. The Muslims had developed what they originally called falcons, which were the beginning of cannons. And of course, cannons will come to Europe, and in time that will of course produce smaller guns, and we'll see more rifles and what will be early attempts at firing, pistols. In fact, the word pistol comes from Pistoia, which is a town in Italy which had created the pistol in the first place. But it'll be many, many years, the 1800s, before we see repeating personal handgun technology. But this is the beginning of that with the cannons. And the cannons actually help France to achieve their goal. Ironically, later, it will be cannons that will help England with their fight with Spain. Just letting you know that little tidbit. All right. But because we only have so much time left in the semester, I'm not going to dwell on all these details. I just want you to know, 100 Years' War, the final effect is the France and English have to stay in England. All right. We could talk about Joan of Arc. We could talk about a number of things, but we don't have time. All right. We see more strong monarchies emerging. Remember how William had started with strong centralized monarchies. Little by little, other countries are following suit. I mean, there was some return to nobles having more control, but overall, the increasing trend is towards strong centralized monarchies. All right. During England's War with the Roses, we're going to have several factions vying for the throne and ending with the Tudors being successful. All right, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, the Lancastrian Wars of the Roses, the Lancasters are the Lannisters in Martin's story. He draws a lot from history, so I thought you might enjoy that too. All right. But we need to talk about other forms of government. Florence, Milan, and Venice all develop republican governments. So it's an oligarchy, it's the noble families, they have representatives, of course it's all male, and they have differing versions of what they consider republican government. All right, but they all have councils, there's voting, there's consensus, and the more important thing you need to know about Venice is this. While everybody else is decrying the Muslims as heretics, and of course the Muslims see the Christians as heretics, and infidels, what's happening is Venice is trading with the Muslim world, all right, which of course is making all the Christians kind of go, wait a minute, what do you mean you're trading with the Muslim world? But they are, and they are taking those goods and they are bringing them into Europe. The reason why you need to know that Venice is trading with the Muslim world is because this is going to bring in a new innovation, paper, which is going to revolutionize European governments. Instead of having to use parchment, which is hard to come by, hard to make, takes forever to make because it's sheep and vellum is calves, now they're going to have paper, which is going to change everything, and a lot more things are going to be written down, and a lot more of the government will be more effective because they have access to this new technology. They're even going to create new pens just for paper. So Venice trading with the Muslim world is important. You see, China created paper, but they weren't using it to record things. They were using silk. And now the Europeans see that paper can be a valuable commodity. In fact, so much so, a lot of the Muslim merchants in the beginning would sell paper kind of at a loss, kind of like if you go in for milk and they give you like a sale on milk and it's like $1 or something. It's to get you into the store so you go buy things. Same thing with paper. The Muslims would give it away at lower rates to get them to buy other things. And Venice, of course, was really the only European group trading with the Muslims, so they were really able to capitalize on this. All right, so just keep in mind Venice and paper and trading with the Muslim world. All right, very important. In fact, Venice created what they called the terra firma. They had taken a group of other cities and towns near them because they're in a lagoon, all right? And they use that as their breadbasket. Terra firma means basically firm ground. And what they did was they built this incredible maritime empire, basically, on the seas. And they had the arsenal, which was building all these warships, and they had a real presence in the Mediterranean and the Black Seas, because again, they're trading with what will become a Muslim stronghold. Constantinople will fall in 1453, and there will be a lot of trade goods to be had. So that's how Venice becomes a strong maritime power. All right, moving forward. Talked about that. Sorry, I'm just flipping through. I apologize. I thought I was going forward, not back. Again, about the church. Now, we do have the papal states begin to develop, but what happens before that is the church falls to French influence, no longer Roman, all right? And of course, this is going to create the so-called Avignon popes, because what happens is, if you remember the Petrine supremacy, where all the popes of Rome were, all that, what's going to happen now is the popes are going to move the papacy to Avignon, which is a city in France. So they move the papacy to Avignon, and this is called the Avignon captivity, the Babylonian captivity, because they think back to like when the Jews were in Babylon, they were slaves. Well, some people were arguing that the popes were like slaves to the French. All right. And the papacy lost power during this time. And then afterward, there was the Great Schism. Suddenly we have two popes. And throughout certain periods of church history, as other events occur, we have two popes and three popes and four popes. But of course, the Pope in Rome, because of the Petrine supremacy that we mentioned earlier, is considered by the true believers to be the proper Pope. But of course, the Avignon papacy had moved from Rome, so one could argue that they and their successors were. So you see where this is going. It gets very, very complicated. So much so that because we are running out of time, I'm not going to again bog you down in the details, because I know semester ends very, very soon. Very, very soon. All right, but what happens is, in the popular worldview, a lot of people feel that the church did not handle the plague well, didn't like the Avignon papacy, and they felt that the church had really lost a lot of ground. They weren't fulfilling their primary mission of taking care of believers, taking care of widows and orphans, and the papal politics began to call for reforms. All right, they realized they have to do something to get back in people's good graces. All right, so what happens is, for the average person, they begin to emphasize good works and tell people, if you just do good works, you'll be more likely to get to heaven. You won't need to be in purgatory as much. And they offer the indulgences again. You might remember I mentioned them last time about, buying your way out of purgatory, so many months, so many years, so many whatever. And this is all going to help the church to become more popular. It's also going to help with building projects. The money from these indulgences will help with building projects. And if you remember Hildegard of Bingen, I mentioned her last time, she was seeing visions. Well, now we have this rise of mystical Christianity, right? Everybody wants to have visions and ecstatic experiences with God. And this actually validates women more with the church. If you remember back to the Council of Nicaea, Constantine had really limited women's participation in the church. Now women's experiences, like Hildegard and like other mystics, begin to be sought. So Of course, not everybody was agreeing with all of this, but overall, people began to slowly see the church in a more positive light. And they began to think more personal religion and personal experiences with God, kind of similar to the mystery cults of the ancient world, if you remember when we talked about Isis and Mithras. All right. So just some parallels there to help, with bringing back what we've looked at earlier. All right. You've heard me speak of Dante's Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is also a scathing criticism of his enemies. All right. But it does talk about purifying the soul and preparing it for salvation. Remember, he starts out in Inferno. He's being, led around by Virgil. He goes through purgatory. He sees his beloved Beatrice in Paradiso or Paradise. And he comes back saying that he's now changed and he's going to do right by God and he's going to be better, a better man for his experience. And of course, anybody who read the story would hopefully also, in his way of, telling the story, his reason for writing it, be also inspired to create positive change in their life. Petrarch wrote love sonnets. Even now, they're very beautiful. He talked about his dear beloved Laura or Laura. All right. Boccaccio, I mentioned earlier about the Decameron. The idea was it was a frame story. It was going to have 100 tales. He didn't finish it. And the other story we really need to visit, and you've heard me mention it before, is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Again, a frame narrative. Frame narratives mean that there is a reason the author gives for the event, for the, this inciting incident, this event that causes them to go and tell stories. So in a frame narrative, Boccaccio's is everybody escapes to the countryside. They're waiting out the plague, so to entertain themselves, they tell stories. Chaucer's is a little more sophisticated, perhaps. His is all these people are going on a pilgrimage. They're in England. They're not able to go to Jerusalem, so they're going to pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas à Becket, St. Thomas à Becket, who was killed on the church stairs because one of the kings at the time, I can't remember, I think it was a Henry from the Tudor dynasty, had told his followers how annoyed he was with Thomas à Becket because he was critical of him. And of course, they went out and slayed Thomas à Becket, thinking they were doing, good work. So Thomas à Becket had a shrine erected at Canterbury because he was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, which was the highest religious post one could have in England. So the frame story is all these people assemble at an inn and they're going to ride to the shrine and go on a pilgrimage. And when they get there, hope for miracles, pray to God, look at the relics, what have you. So Chaucer is sending up certain evils and human foibles and kind of poking fun of the human condition. It's a very sophisticated story. And what he does is he brings all of his people together, and you can tell right away, like one or two of them are really pious and they're really good people, like the poor shire priest who's really trying to do right by his flock. And then you have people like the knight who seems on the surface to be all good, but is he really? His son, the squire, is kind of flighty and he's making fun of the, the follies of youth. And then there's the prioress who's a nun, but she has a pin that says love conquers all, and you have to ask what kind of love is she talking about, and she's not clearly following a vow of poverty. She's wearing gold and jewelry, and the monk is hunting and hawking. You've heard me mention this before. He clearly is not giving up his noble life from before. He's still doing the things a nobleman would want to do to entertain himself. The pardoner and the summoner are supposed to be in church office and helping people, and they're actually pretty horrible people, you realize as you read between the lines. All right. So the reason I bring this up is because Chaucer gives us a snapshot of medieval life that we really, we can't take it as fact, but it gives us an idea of what's truly important in the medieval society and how different groups interacted. it gives us a variety of status, because we have people who are highborn, we have people who are lowborn. We have a nice slice of life, if you will. While fictional, we have to allow something for that. It gives us an insight into how different groups would have possibly interacted with one another. And of course, it solidifies how important the pilgrimage was to the medieval audience. And if you've never read it, it's a delightful story. I highly recommend it. And interestingly, English has changed. It's no longer more like Old Norse. Old English is very much like Old Norse, but now we have Middle English. It's not modern yet. It has more of what we would perceive as modern. You know, it's far different. When we look at Old English, we look at something that's so foreign to us. But when we look at Middle English, it's much closer to what we know today. So the language is shifting, things are changing. All right, and speaking of changes, people begin to worry about health concerns after the Black Death. So for the survivors and their descendants, things begin to become a little bit better. Now, they're nowhere near as sophisticated as we are in terms of being able to treat all the different diseases, but they begin to want more sanitation. So they've moved tanners outside the cities and outside the towns because they deal with animal remains. They begin to regulate how far you should go before you dump your night soil. Remember, we mentioned chamber pots. All right. They start to look at how many people should be living in a building. All right, so slowly we start to see our modern life come into focus here. Prostitution had never been regulated before. Now they want prostitutes to submit to more regular checkups to see if they're carrying any kind of disease. All right, and of course, you know, these are all positive things. You know, they're worried now about keeping people healthy. All right, but it's also, you would think with all of the changes and with all of the crumbling away of serfdom and with like people kind of forsaking their morality for a while, you would think that there'd be less of a division of gender roles. But unfortunately, while the economy is still recovering, because during Chaucer's day, the economy was improving, men have to be more the breadwinners and women have to be more stay at home. And I mean, this was the norm for so many years. So they also said men were active and women were passive, all right, and that each should only do the duties given, all right. Of course, the problem is if you're a woman without a husband or a father, you have no one to look after you. It's very hard to take care of your children, all right. And women, you know, did have some new opportunities after the plague. They began to take in laundry and they began to take in boarders and they began to do whatever they needed to do if there was no male figure in order to survive. Some craftsmen, if all they had were daughters left after the plague, would teach them the trade because the sons were dead. But overall, gender roles persisted and became in some ways even more solidified. All right. Of course, education becomes more important because as more and more people embrace trade as a route to becoming more economically viable, because slowly people began to buy things again, they began to trade, they began to need things. And with paper, suddenly you have a need for secretaries, men who can write, men who can read, men who can create contracts, whatever the case may be. Apprenticeships became important, education became important, all right? And with the plague, medicine had a crisis. People needed to know more how things worked. How does the human body work? Vesalius's treatise, which will come along about 200 years later, showing the circulatory system, was a major breakthrough. But at first, it took a long time to get to that point, you know, trial and error. All right, clocks. People began to actually now look at time. Before it was, okay, the sun's up, the sun's going down. Oh, it's midday, the sun's at its highest point. But, and, you know, in towns, they began to have town clocks. Slowly, people began to conform to more of a clock-driven schedule. So now clocks are becoming more widely available, so more towns are getting them. Some noble individuals who have money are getting them, all right? Eyeglasses. If you're like me and occasionally you need a little help, well, they learned how to grind lenses and correct sight and vision. Of course, this will also pay off in the scientific revolution. We'll see telescopes and the beginning of microscopes, all right? And of course, paper and gunpowder, all right? So we're starting to see during this high Middle Ages, moving slowly toward the Renaissance, there's a lot of technology that's beginning to come out. All right, it's still not like what you and I see today, but it's much closer than it was. All right, I know we've covered a lot of ground in this chapter. To set you up for next chapter, I just want to mention to you there is no clear line of demarcation between the medieval period and the Renaissance. All right, they just kind of flow right into the other. So just to set you up. So a lot of these changes happening in the High Middle Ages are preparing us for the Renaissance, which will be this short burst of culture and art and learning and science and technology and experiments and so many things. But we'll talk about that, when we get to it. All right, I hope this is helpful. As you can see, these plague now, they're starting to put in the death figure, and Death will eventually have his black cape and his scythe because, the scythe was the harvesting instrument, and basically they were thinking people were like wheat or grass and they could just be, harvested with the scythe. That's the reasoning behind creating the death figure. And of course, death begins to appear in art more and more and more, even through the Renaissance, because again, remember, we're going to have these waves of plague, all right? And as you can see, there's the map showing, it hits, it comes to Italy because they have all these trade opportunities, comes on a ship, and it got so bad, people began to actually have to declare if they had plague on the ship, and if they did, you'd be quarantined until you were done and allowed in, all right? So as you can see, more illustration. For now, they could make coffins. At some points, it became so bad people were buried in mass graves without coffins. Some towns asked for the church bells to stop ringing because it used to be they would ring the bells for funerals and weddings and other rites of passage, such as your confirmation or whatever. And now, for a while, the church bells actually had fallen silent. Some believed it was a judgment of God. And then, of course, because of those who were left realized that they had more leverage, they were able to revolt and in some cases successfully petition for greater rights. As I said, all that bad feeling between France and England will come to a head. The 100 Years' War. Here's an example of a primary document. This is a painting that was showing how, they fought. All right, and of course, the longbow. The English longbow was preferred to the crossbow. Crossbows took forever to wind and to shoot. They had much more force, but the English longbow was easier to use. Problem is, you had to be really strong to draw it back, but it was much more, shall we say, effective. As you can see here, a skilled archer could launch 10 to 12 arrows a minute. That's a lot. Crossbow, you might be lucky to get 1 or 2 off, in 5 minutes, because again, they had a loop, you'd have to put your foot through it and use it to wind back the string, and a lot more complicated. All right, and you can see here's the map showing all the different battles. The Holy Roman Empire, not quite what it used to be. Remember the Treaty of Verdun when it got split, and then successive Roman emperors did not have as much territory as Charlemagne. And of course, notice now we have the Papal States. They will become a major player as we move into the Renaissance. Notice here the Republic of Venice. Remember, Venice is in a lagoon. Here's all your terra firma. Here's all your breadbasket. And that was how they, were successful at home. And then, of course, were able to go out on the seas and create that maritime empire. Unfortunately, we also have a new event, a new group show up because of all these events. I'm bringing you back to to the map of Italy for a moment. Remember I mentioned earlier there's like a chessboard and everybody kind of kept fighting their wars there? All right, notice how all of these different territories, they're going to shift. All right, they're going to move, they're going to grow, they're going to fade. Condottieri, condotti means contract. All right, these are contract soldiers. They're mercenaries, all right? And a lot of the ones who came into Italy were foreigners. Remember we talked about the Crusades and that outgrowth of young men, and cynically some historians think it was to get that energy out of Europe because they didn't need them. Well, each war had survivors. They were between wars. They needed to support themselves. So a lot of the condottieri emerged as soldiers who had nowhere else to go. They created these companies with these, you know, really romantic names like the Company of the White Star, for example. And some of these condottieri rose up and became noblemen. Some of them were able to marry nobly because they had money and they were able to get noble brides and create, you know, in a way, dynasties. While they weren't fighting as much anymore, they were, you know, able to get titles, and their descendants would go on to have, you know, really nice lives. The Sforzas, for example. But some of them were brutal. John Hawkwood was especially known for his brutality. All right. And of course, when they were, you had to keep paying them while they were working for you, because if you didn't, they could very well turn on you. And a lot of condottieri did shape the events of Italy for many, many years. All right. And again, we have the conflict between the church and the state, because remember, we talked about Innocent III and Gregory, who believed they could depose kings and emperors. Nobility agreed after the Black Death and the breakdown with the Avignon papacy. All right. So just some things to keep in mind. Some artwork, as you can see. We did mention how women did not have a lot of opportunity. Christine de Pizan, basically Christine of Pisa, was an extraordinary woman. She was an exception to the rule. She was a writer who supported herself and her children with her writing. So she was clearly an exception to this rule. But it shows that some women could gain, you know, through their skills, a life and a profession for themselves. All right. We start to see the beginning of perspective emerge with Giotto. Also shading. So now more three-dimensional. Remember we talked about how, you know, things became flat, and now we go from this to slowly this with this three-dimensionality, and it's going to just keep increasing. So slowly this flat art style is going to begin to decrease. Interestingly, if you're a musician, this is finally the beginning of written music. It used to be people would simply hand down their songs to people by teaching them themselves. Now, while it's not quite the same as a modern scale, we finally begin to see the beginnings of written music. So now, even if you don't have access to the original musician, if you have a copy of their song, you can play it. And troubadours who sing songs basically set to, you know, with love poems begin to emerge and travel around Europe. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. Here's your timeline. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you in chapter 12, all right? And of course, as always, you know, please feel free to stop by my office hours on Google Meets. And I hope you have a great day. And for now, I think that's it, all right? So take care. Have a great time. You know, I hope this video helps, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.